Mr. President, I now ask consent that my last statement be placed as a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to discuss an issue I'd hoped I wouldn't need to bring up today, but unfortunately I do. I'm referring to the continued imprisonment of the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yulia Tymoshenko, who's now sat in jail for almost 2 years. In the fall of 2011, Ms. Tymoshenko was imprisoned for a 7-year term on charges that she abused her office in connection with a natural gas contract with Russia. I can't judge the wisdom of that contract, but it's deeply troubling to me is the appearance of selective and politically motivated imprisonment of a former political leader in that democratic nation of Ukraine. Ukraine is a promising, hopeful new member of the community of free market democracies, one with a solid future in the West. It has strong ties to Europe and the United States. This photo shows police officers leading former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko out of the courtroom after the verdict in her case in Kiev on October the 11th, 2011. Ukraine is a great nation. It has helped NATO in Bosnia, Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It's a major contributor to valuable international peacekeeping. It was an early leader in throwing the shackles of the Soviet Union away and declaring its own independence. In 2004, Ms. Tymoshenko and countless other Ukrainians organized a series of historic protests known as the Orange Revolution to address electoral fraud in the presidential election in those days. Ukraine's future is clearly with the community of democracies. That's why the imprisonment of this former prime minister is so troubling. When you're a member of a community of democracies, you don't selectively throw your political opponents in jail for questionable policy decisions. If a poor policy decision was made, let the voters decide at the ballot box. In the neighboring dictatorship of Belarus, where 2010 presidential candidate Mikhail Stakevich, who had the temerity to run against the strongman dictator Viktor Lukashenko, still sits in jail because he challenged the dictator in an election. I might remind my friends in Ukraine, they do not want to be compared with Belarus. They should be democratic. Countless international human rights groups in other countries have decried the charges against Ms. Tymoshenko, calling for her release. The Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe passed a resolution in January 2012 declaring that the articles under which Ms. Tymoshenko was convicted were overly broad in application and effectively allow for ex post facto criminalization of normal political decision-making. Later that year, both the European Parliament and our very own Senate passed resolutions condemning the sentencing of Ms. Tymoshenko, calling for her release. The European Court of Human Rights, which settles cases of rights abuses after plaintiffs have exhausted appeals in their home country courts, recently considered this case and ruled that Ms. Tymoshenko's pretrial detention was unlawful, that the lawfulness of her detention had not been properly reviewed, and that her right to liberty had been restricted. She had no possibility to seek compensation for her unlawful deprivation, and that is unacceptable. I truly hope this ruling would finally create the circumstances for a face-saving way out of this mess. Unfortunately, regrettably, it hasn't happened. That's why I've joined my colleagues, Senators Rubio, Boxer, Barrasso, Murphy, and Cardin, introducing a resolution on the matter. It's simple and straightforward, expresses continuing concern about Ms. Tymoshenko's selective and politically motivated detention. Mr. President, let me close by saying I was in Ukraine last year. I met with Prime Minister Azarov and President Yanukovych. They were generous hosts and very kind. They told me something would be done in a positive way about Ms. Tymoshenko's imprisonment. That was a year ago. Nothing has happened. I was optimistic then. I'll remain optimistic, but I want the Ukraine government to know we are going to hold them to the standards of democracy. You don't imprison your political opponents. You beat them in an election, you move on to lead. You're held accountable by the people who vote. I hope the decision will be made in the near future to release Ms. Tymoshenko, and I yield the floor.